And welcome back to another episode of Pokemon Knowledge. Yesterday, I got tagged on Instagram, on Discord, on private messages, you name it. More people tagged me on the pre-release Raichu than I've ever been tagged in anything in my entire life. But there's a, all right, there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about. Number one, I'm a big Raichu fan. More importantly than that, I'm a big base set Raichu fan. And this is the thing. When it comes to the pre-release Raichu, I have always been very, very familiar with the pre-release Raichu. I've talked about the pre-release Raichu for hours. I've had Joe Echo-based Collectibles on my channel. We've talked about it in two long conversations. Joe's not just one of the few. Joe is actually the only person that I personally know that have seen that card in person. Joe saw it from one of the old Wizard of the Coast employees, used to bring it around to conventions with him. If you guys aren't familiar with that story, I recommend going back, listening to that live where Joe goes into depth about seeing that card in person. And I've always been in the camp of that is a real card. Now, the thumbnail of this video might throw you off a little bit, but we'll definitely get into that. But I've seen the sheet, like the alleged sheet that it's come off of, where you have the Clefable, the Raichu, and then all the theme deck hollows in it. I've seen one in person. Rusty has it in person. I've been to Rusty's house. I've seen that sheet in person. It makes sense. The story to me always made sense. Even when I looked at that sheet, I was talking to two people about it. Pokemon Radar was sitting right there, and Gem Mint Pokemon was right there, and we were talking about that sheet, talking about how that is where, the pre-release Raichu probably came from. Now, this is the thing. For me, the pre-release Raichu is my ultimate chase. It's my white whale. So from Moby Dick, it is my absolute white whale. But the thing is in Moby Dick also has one of my favorite quotes, and it's, ignorance is the parent of fear. And I feel like that saying works so well in this situation. Ignorance is the parent of fear, because all that means is you're just scared of what you don't understand, or scared of what you don't know. And I feel like a lot of the thought process that went behind like the authentication process that CGC was using was a lot of like that ignorance part to it. And like that's the only thing. So while I've always believed that that card is, a real card. All right. First of all, we get into the semantics. I didn't want to make this video too because you're getting into a lot of the nitty gritty. There is a very large difference in what is considered like a real card versus what is an authentic card. Like, people hear real card or fake card in this hobby, and they instantly go to the absolute extremes. Real meaning that is a real card printed at a facility. Fake meaning it is a knockoff. That is not... Nobody in this hobby talking about the pre-release Raichu, when we use the word fake or not authentic, we're not talking about the actual card itself as not being. That's where, like, a little bit of the disconnect already comes. I've started to see some people have that conversation about what is real versus what is authentic for this card. Now, this is the thing. There's, like, a lot of, like, what... Alright, this goes back to like the Protostoys. It goes back to all these cards. What CGC is using to authenticate these cards is they're using the words of a lot of these Wizard of the Coast employees. And the fact of the matter is the word of these Wizard of the Coast employees, they all have like vested interest in those cards. And you might like hear that and say, no, they don't have vested interest in these cards because they don't own these cards anymore. And that conversation is true. They don't own the cards, so maybe they don't have a vested interest in the future value of those cards. But they do have a vested interest in the fact that they were the ones that sold those cards. So they need to tell a story in a way that works so they don't look like scummy people for selling those cards. Or maybe they don't know the full story, so maybe they make up the story. And now this is a problem with that pre-release Raichu. There are two very good sources. You got that Mike Boozer guy, which, shout out to the last name Boozer. Dude probably was a great time in college, probably a great person to hang out with. You always want to hang out with somebody whose last name is Boozer. But the problem is he had a vested interest in that card. He sold that card for a lot of money. And so actually from that CGC article, I always quoted the price of that card being sold at of $10,000. But in fact, that card sold for $10,500. And people hear that number, and I don't think people like comprehend how much $10,500 is in 2009. People think that like pre-release Raichus were the same prices as say like first edition Charizards or something. No, they weren't even close. In 2009, you could get, like $1,200, $1,100, like if you really shopped around for a PSA 10 first edition base set Charizard. And here's an example of a story of a card that sold for $1,800. Shout out to MK Poke CC. He's been a guest on my channel. In 2009, he bought a Super Secret Battle Mewtwo, the number 3 trainer. He was the first person in the world to ever grade that card a PSA 10. He bought that card for $1,800 in 2009. So think about that. Just like think about these numbers. So when people say like, oh, $10,000 wasn't a lot. It was a lot. I just told you that SSB Mewtwo's sold for $1,800. I just told you that first edition PSA 10 Charizards sold for like $1,100 to $1,200. There is a huge range from that to $10,000. Or in fact, it was $10,500. So that was a huge sale. That is 5x the highest sales for pretty much any card we've seen at that time. So it's a lot of money. The people that sold that card have vested interest. Now, the issues we run into is we have production managers at Wizard of the Coast saying other stories. Now, this is where we're going to lose a lot of people. This is where you get into the nitty-gritty of this hobby, and to be honest, for most people, this isn't going to be a video for you. This is when we really get into a lot of stuff, and a lot of people are instantly going to say, like, if you don't have a vested interest in this card, like, why do you care? It's like, well, you should care because while I may never, well, I shouldn't say I may never own that card. I will never own that card. That card will always be out of my price range, and that's why that's still my white whale. That card that I would always love to get, and if I had to pick one card in this entire hobby that I would want to own, it is the pre-release Raichu. But it's the thing is, I'm not going to like sit here and have a ton of ignorance to the actual story of that card. And the problem is CGC did that. They put the blinders on. Once again, they only reached out to the people that had the vested interest who sold that card at some point down the line. And yes, the buyer of that card was Dave Persons on both. Now, you run into weird issues too, where we're going to get down the rabbit hole. I'm telling you, this video is not for everybody. I'm sorry. But when you look at like the pre-release Clefable, when you look at the pre-release Raichu, like that 5.5 grade, it has like all the beat up edges that you expect from a pre-release Clefable. If they were cut together and potentially printed together, that Raichu should also have all the same issues that the pre-release Clefable have. And if you don't know what those issues are, is there's pre-release Clefables are as famous for having whitening issues on corners just because of whatever the dull blades or whatever was cutting those cards. So like the conversation and the issue is, were these cards separate? And that 5.5 Raichu, like, yeah, it has those indications of that poorly cut corners. That PSA 8 copy of it doesn't really have those poorly cut corners you would expect from cards that were being cut at the same time as pre-release Clefables and being all together. This is where you get into that real nitty gritty. Like even the pre-release Clefable, why I know what that card is. Most of the people watching this video know what the pre-release Clefable is. The majority of this hobby, honestly, probably doesn't even know what the pre-release Clefable is, and definitely probably doesn't know that the pop report for that card in a PSA 10 is 0. And the likelihood of that card staying a PSA pop 0 in PSA 10 is probably pretty close to 100%, because you would expect that if there are any pre-release Clefables that exist out there in true Gem Mint 10 condition, that they would have been graded down the line. We've seen people like, here's a great example. Gary King Pokemon one time sourced 180 pre-release Clefables. Out of that 180 pre-release Clefables he sourced, he's got 0. Now, I've talked to a lot of people about this pre-release Clefable. I've talked to Gary King Pokemon. Me and him have had conversations about the pre-release, pre-release Raichu. Me and Gary have had conversations about the pre-release Raichu. I've had really in-depth conversations with Charlie Herlacher about like the heat foil stamping. When it comes to heat foil stamping, Charlie Herlacher is on a next level. I learned more about that process from him in one conversation than I have at any other point in my entire life. Charlie knows about like the heat press process more than anybody. Now, it's not like a complicated thing. It's an after the fact thing too. And it's very similar to like if anybody out there has a Bible, when you get a Bible, maybe you go through like, catechism, or maybe you get a Bible during your confirmation or whatever. Like sometimes they'll heat press like that foil with your name in it. And that's all it is. It's not anything crazy. Now, with the card, they're not really doing that heat stamping, call it, but it's still like putting that gold foil on after the fact. And if you look at some cards, those pre-release stamps are not perfectly centered. Sometimes they're like, some of the letters are missing. It's not a perfect process. That's why you see a lot of issues going on with those pre-release stamps. So I saw some people commenting about why are the two pre-release stamps not in the exact same spot on the card? Like, that is very normal because a lot of that was done after the fact. But the thing is that is very reproducible. Now, I did see that CGC went through like a little bit more of the authenticity process where they did like what are XRF scans where they're kind of looking for the actual like the composition of the foil itself, like the zinc however much zinc was in it, and all the like these different magnesium and all these little different elements that make up that stamp itself, and like lined it up to known examples of pre-release Clefable. And I think that's all good. And again, I've always been in the camp of the pre-release Raichu is a real card. The problem is when it goes back to like what I said earlier, is where like just ignorance is the parent of fear. Like, I feel like CGC was very fearful in hearing the other side of the story, because the other side of the story is like confirmed stories from that production manager from Wizard of the Coast. And if you guys didn't see my community post earlier, I posted Rusty TCA's gaming video that he posted today about the pre-release Raichu. Honestly, you should go watch that video way before you watch my video. To be honest with you, you should watch that video before you watch CGC's press release. Before you watch any videos on the pre-release Raichu, you should go back and watch Rusty's video, because at the time, Rusty had a relationship with one of the production managers at Wizard of the Coast, and the way that production manager said that the pre-release Raichu was produced, that it was printed on a sheet of 100 cards, like, to be honest with you, like, I don't even really believe that story as much from the production manager, because I have in person, like I told you, been to Rusty's house, seen those theme deck sheets, seen the Clefable on there, I've seen the Raichu right next to it. Then the conversation is, well, if there's a pre-release Clefable, and then there's a pre-release Raichu, well, what's the next card on that? Well, the next card is a Hitmonchan. Well, how come we've never seen a pre-release Hitmonchan? Why did we only ever see the Clefable? Why did we ever only see the Raichu? Wouldn't we see that whole line? And especially if it was like that top line, or were they actually hand sorting these sheets and taking these cards out? Like, you're getting into like a lot of the semantics, but these are the conversations people have been having for not a short amount of time, like greater than a decade. These conversations have been had about this pre-release Raichu. Now, the problem is when I said that my favorite quote is, ignorance is the parent of fear. Like, now, this is a crazy thing, is CGC like quotes Rusty's video in a way. In that video, talks about like one of the sheets Rusty has, uses that as an example for the pre-release Clefable. It talks about it as an example for that pre-release Raichu, because they're right next to each other in that top left corner of the sheet. The only problem is they don't talk about the letter that Rusty has received from a production manager at Wizard of the Coast saying how those cards were produced. Now, why is that important? Well, because her story contradicts like Mike Boozer's story and the other people. And to be honest with you, the other story, they didn't even know how they got that card. It seemed that they just found it in a binder. It had a little post-it note on the backside of it on a penny sleeve, said, here's a mistake for you. So they don't even know how they got that card, so they can't confirm Mike Boozer's story. Now, this is that problem, is CGC, when they go to authenticate these things, it's one thing for them to just go out and say, all right, this is how we're going to authenticate this card. We looked at the card material. This is a real card. We looked at the pre-release stamp, and the pre-release stamp matches with that XRF, analysis. All the metals in it and all the materials are the same. They do line up with known examples of pre-release fables. And then because of those reasons, we authenticated this card, and that's where they left it. That is one thing, but that's not what CGC did. CGC decided to go above and beyond and tried to show the provenance of this card. And just because Dave Persons bought this card from a Wizard of the Coast employee who worked there, that doesn't instantly give merit to their story, that the story that they're telling is in fact 100% true. So this is where the problems come. And then the issue of, was this a mistake that just kind of left? Is there really only 11 cards? Because now we have, Mike Boozer saying that there's 11 copies of this card that exist, where now you have a production manager from Wizard of the Coast saying, no, there is potentially 100 of these cards that exist. And these are not two people that were just no-name people. These were actual people that worked at Wizard of the Coast. And you can say, well, what was Mike Boozer's job versus what was the production manager's job? And the production manager's job should carry more weight because they were in charge of, guess what? Production. And so, that's the problem where this card's going to fall. And the problem is, too, and shout out to Son of a Mewtwo. He said, just supporting the channel. I appreciate that. Oh, God. Spilling water all over myself. But this is the problem. So now you have these conflicting stories, and CGC doesn't even mention the conflicting stories. And the problem with this card too is pre-release Raichu has a ton of fakes that exist. Now this is where we get into the different conversation. So I just told you, nobody is saying that the card isn't real, that the stamp isn't real for those cards. This is where we get into more of the semantics. And I told you this video is not going to be for everybody. And for most people at home, this is where if you're writing down, it's going to be where it's going to be really hard for you to follow. Now, there are a lot of pre-release Raichus that are known fakes, which I just told you, we all agree that these cards were potentially real, came from Wizard of the Coast. But now I'm also telling you that there are real cards with fake stamps. And then you get into the nuances of the fake stamps. The fake stamps of the color brown that they used. Then the color red that they used for pre-release versus the color green they used for pre-release stamps. This is where you're really getting into I'm telling you, the absolute truest of semantics for this card, because there was a lot of fake stamps. And the pre-release Raichu, one of the reasons it's talked about so much in this story is there's a lot of people bought pre-release Raichus that ended up being found out to be fake. And how those people react, I don't want to get into the super negative, but there was a lot of people that when they found out their cards were fake, didn't handle it well, and in fact probably handled it as poorly as anybody could handle bad news. So there are really bad stories about that card too, because there's so many known fakes. And I just told you the reason why there's known fakes is in 2009, when Dave Persons bought this card for $10,500, that is a crazy amount of money. And there's nothing inherently special about that Raichu opposed to that stamp. And I know, in this hobby, stamps mean a lot. But it is something that could potentially be, counterfeited, because there's nothing. And then this is where people are going to get into that conversation, and it's a good conversation to have. It's okay, well, you're telling me that these hot foil stamps can be faked. Well, why are somebody going to fake the pre-release Raichu stamp? Well, why can't they just do any other of the pre-releases? Why can't they copy a pre-release Clefairy? Why can't you put a stamp on that and get a real good, unlimited jungle copy, put a pre-release stamp on it, get the only PSA 10 that exists? Why can't you do, every single Aerodactyl you have and all these different cards? And then let's go to the higher end of the extreme. If you could, recreate these stamps, why aren't they doing it with every single Worlds card? Why is every single Worlds card not all became finalist cards overnight? These are all good conversations that people are have, and I'm not an expert enough in the gold foil stamping. Again, the person that I hope like talks about this and is able to talk about this in a public forum is going to be somebody like Charlie Herlacher, who is a little bit more like knowledgeable about stuff like this. But there are like examples of Worlds cards, even finalist cards, that when they went to do that gold press foiling, like the foiling didn't even stick to the card to begin with. It rubbed off in the first place. So like even that process is not a perfect process. But the problem is the only thing that I don't like about the story, while I told you I am still in the camp of this is a real card. I've always thought it was a real card, but I'm not going to lie to you. I've always sort of been in the camp of this is a real card, because to say that this card was real, you were kind of like on the fringes maybe of the hobby, where like it was a fun little argument to have. Like you get to pick a side, right? Like what side do you want to be on? Do you want to be on the side of, this card was a mistake, it never should have got released out of the factory, like, all these things, how many of it, exist? Should we give merit to these cards? Should we not? Is it a one-off thing? Is the history behind these cards like way too overblown? And all like the little semantics that we like to do for that. Or do you want to be, it's like, which side do you want to be on? And I always want to be on the side of like, this is a real card, but goes back to it. I was never ignorant to like the other half of that story. I was never ignorant to like the emails that Rusty had with that production manager, who gave a very like counterdictive story. And the problem is CGC just has this innate ability where they're willing to put their name behind anything. And you know what? It's getting frustrating that they're willing to put their name behind everything, and they're just not looking at all the facts. Like, when they graded this card, they needed to reach out to more people than just the people that sold that card. I don't care that they were Wizard of the Coast employees, because I literally just told you a production manager at Wizard of the Coast has a very contradictory story about that card. And this is the thing too. Now, people will hear that and they'll try to run it with a different way, like, oh, you're saying that these cards weren't real. No. I just told you that this is one thing that is like true across the board. Nobody denies that card existed. The production manager said pre-release Raichus existed. Mike Boozer said those pre-release Raichus existed. Like, everybody's in agreement that those cards were created, that they did exist. But the problem is the stories don't match. So when you're going to go to like authenticate this card and find that provenance of the card, when you are listening to somebody's story, you can't just take their story and use that in your article and say, well, this is the truth, because we don't know it's the truth. And to be honest with you, when these cards were produced, we're talking 99. We are about 25 years, give or 24 years, removed from that timeline. A lot of information can get forgotten. A lot of information can get like changed in people's heads, because at the time that those pre-release Raichus were being stamped, whether it was purposely or accidentally, nobody ever probably stopped to think like, oh, in the future, this could be a 6-figure card someday. Let me do this. No, it was probably done either one as a mistake, or you have a bunch of people just messing around with that machine and they had a bunch of Raichus there and they're like, hey, let's just stamp these Raichus too and let's see what we want to do with them. We'll just hand them out to a couple of the workers here. It's like, oh, look at this mistake I made. Here's a pre-release Raichu. Here's something for you for your personal. And that's the thing too. And then you go into the conversation of, when you change that story, does that change the merits of that card? So, if it was a bunch of people messing around in that, like at Wizard of the Coast doing the pre-release stamp, does it now like take away from that card? Or if it was done as a mistake and then they caught it, they destroyed some of them, these weren't supposed to come out, then does that change the story a little bit? And it's like no one really has a perfect answer for that. That's why a card like this is always going to have this like weird buyer pool of this card. And to be honest with you, if I could afford that pre-release Raichu and I could actually be a buyer of it, I would love to. I would love to own that card. I told you, it is my white whale of the hobby. The problem is that card will probably sell for 6 figures. That will be, like a $200,000+ card in my opinion, even in a CGC 5.5, because the provenance, like, while we might not agree on like the actual semantics of it, but the provenance is still like that it came from Wizard of the Coast, that it still had that seal, that it became famous. And you can make the argument when it comes to the pre-release Raichu, it is one of the, if not the most famous card. Now, this is where you get a little bit of that semantics. Maybe you can say that that was the most famous card in this hobby 7 years ago. Because I think 7 years ago, the people that are maybe like engaged in this hobby, maybe were a little bit more focused on things like that. Where now I think maybe people don't really probably do, I would say for the average collector, maybe they're not really doing the absolute in-depth research into pre-release Raichus and how many existed and how they were potentially printed and what the sheets look like. Like, I've seen the sheets in person. That is a card that I love to talk about, the pre-release Raichu. I've always been fascinated with that card forever. And to be honest with you, before this video started, I tried to think back when was the first time I ever even heard about the pre-release Raichu, and I couldn't even recall. Meaning, I've known that card, in my opinion, forever. Because I cannot remember a point in this hobby where I did not know this card existed. So it just shows you, like, how important that card has been for such a long time in this hobby, and it's always been like the card of speculation, that card of the what ifs. And I didn't know that Dave Persons owned two of them. I knew he owned the one, but I didn't know he owned the second one. I don't even know like when that came up for sale or anything. Now, I'm going to get into this like conversation way more in depth on Saturday. On Saturday, we have a great guest coming on the channel. We got Peak That Choose coming on. Now, the thing about Peak is he's good friends with Dave Person. They've been out to like lunch and dinner together. They have conversations all the time. They're friends. And then I also want to bring Peak on because there's been a lot of big world cards that have gone on recently. And when it comes to world cards, I have a very like surface level knowledge of a lot of those cards. It's okay, but not nearly this type of like knowledge that Peak the Chew has. I consider Peak the Chew like an expert when it comes to a lot of these world cards. So there's a lot of questions I have about recent seals, and I want to like pick his brain. And the same thing with the pre-release Raichu. I want to have like a more in-depth conversation with him about the pre-release Raichu. But you know, it's just, I guess what it boils down to is there's like a part of me that is happy that somebody was finally willing to grade this card. The only problem I have with it is that it was CGC. And again, I feel like they do very half-ass research every time. And it's just, in a way, disappointing. And I would like to see, like, now, this is a problem too now. CGC, now that they graded this card, they now also have a vested interest in this card. So for them to, in a way, suppress the information that goes against their verification or goes against their research is a really shitty way to go about business. And I hope everybody out there could at least understand that. Like, when CGC authenticated that card and put out that press release, I think it is their duty to not only like give out all the information that they used to authenticate this card and like show its lineage and talk about the people it came from and all this stuff, but I also believe it's CGC's duty to tell the other side of the story. Because if you don't tell that other side of the story, be like, these are all the things we did, and by the way, there was a production manager that worked at Wizards of the Coast, admitted that this card was real, that pre-release Raichu was released, but also said that these cards came out on sheets of 100 cards. There was 100 Raichus per sheet. This is a like person that at least should be considered as, you know, a source, because they were a production manager at Wizard of the Coast. But no, we're going to ignore everything that production manager said and, you know, only go with the side of the story with the people who sold this card at one point, who literally have a financial vested interest in this card in some point in history. And that point in history for Mike Boozer was 2009. That is a problem. And just the fact that CGC didn't even include that in the article is rough. Now, I'm going to play all sides. Listen, the production manager, like the information that they also released, a lot of the information that they said, as if it was fact, came out to be false in the future. One of the things they talk about is like no damage Ninetales. How many of the no damage Ninetales sheets the production manager thought existed, and how many of those cards potentially would be found in history, those numbers were way off. because the amount of no damage Ninetales that exist between all the different no damage Ninetale collectors, Nick Old School Pokemon being number one. And Rusty touched on all this in his video, and that's why I told you should go back and watch that video first. Some of that information was false, but some of the information within like those emails was not false. And that is where, like, in a way, it actually lends more credence to what they're saying. And you might hear that and be like, no, that doesn't lend more credence. No, in fact, it does lend more credence, because it just shows that people's memories are not perfect. So to say Mike Boozer's memory, somebody who worked at Wizard of the Coast, is perfect is just counterintuitive in a way. So it's just tough. And you got to show all sides. If you're going to play like the true authenticator, and you are going to stay as, because in a way, CGC's role in this whole thing should be completely unbiased. Like, just, we're going to look at this card for what it is, and we're going to take all possible resources and then come to a conclusion for that. And that is fine if that the conclusion they came to with all information provided was, this card is real and this is why. But to say, like, by the way, this other information doesn't exist, we're just going to bury this, hope that the internet doesn't run with this forever. And that's the problem now, because the question will always be, well, did CGC know this information? Did CGC reach out to this production manager? Because now you're grading a very important card. You know this information exists, if that is the case. We don't know if CGC actually knew that. We had emails from former WotC production managers saying different stories about how this card was released. Now the question becomes for CGC, did you know that these emails existed? And if so, did you reach out to that production manager? Because if you're grading this card because it's an important card, they knew it was an important card. There's a reason there's news articles written about it. There's a reason there's CGC press releases written about it. There's a reason why there's little Instagram stories with, like the biggest shill in the history of this hobby, in my opinion. Matt Quinn, the guy who will sit next to Chumley and grade Chumley's unlimited jungle Pikachu and Eevee and give them pristine 10s, but yet you can't call graders and all that shit. I'm not going to go on my CGC soapbox right now, but just CGC, in my opinion, is one of the worst companies that has ever come out of Pokemon, especially out of all the hype and everything. And just, again, CGC just does this really, really, absolutely shitty. They are the fucking worst. I'm just going to say it. CGC is a fucking worst company in the entire TCG space. They just continuously, do this really, really shitty, poor business practices. And that's what this type of grading is. And the worst part of all this is I was always on the side of this is a real card. All I ever wanted from this hobby was that card. All I ever wanted was that card to just be real. That's all I wanted. I wanted that card to be real forever. I always wanted it to be real. There's a reason I told you I talked about that card every single chance I get. There's a reason why I was the one that always said, I was the one that created the quote that all the people that said that card is fake are going to just say it's fake until they own it. I created that saying. You can go on my old videos and hear me talk about pre-release Raichu. I use that saying that everyone that thinks it's fake only thinks it's fake until they own it. That was me. I created that saying. I was the first person to ever say that. I always wanted that card to be real, but I just wish that the one company that finally did the actual thing, which probably should have got done a long time ago, always in my opinion, just how they could botch it. You botched one of the best moments, in my opinion, in this hobby. You can't look at all sides. You can't give honest reviews. You can't give an honest authentication. You can't be a good company for just once in your entire career. Just do the right thing once. Just CGC is so bad. It's just disappointing. It's a sad day in this hobby. And it's so sad that CGC was the one that fucking authenticate this and how they could just botch it so poorly. They had the option. They were handed a golden ticket. And Dave Persons went up to CGC multiple times and tried to get this card authenticated by CGC. And CGC turned him down multiple times. But now things changed. What changed? I don't know. This is all speculative. This could just be your opinion. But, like, maybe it changed the fact that CGC is just dying as a company and they're just trying to cling on to whatever thing they can cling on to. And if this is a news article they want to cling on to, so be it. But God forbid CGC puts all the information out there and says, by the way, there's a production manager from Wizard of the Coast freaking emailed when people had their contact and gave a completely different story on the release of this card, which totally contradict Mike Boozer's story. Maybe we should just include that. No. Just couldn't do it. Just could not do it. Shitty. It's sad. It's sad. You take something really good, make it really bad. But, anyways. You know how I feel about CGC. You know, CGC, they hurt me. I'll show you on the dial where they hurt me. And it's not nice. Like, CGC had their opportunity. And I don't want to make this all about, like, a CGC rant. Because I have plenty of those that exist out there. But just time and if you don't believe me, you could go on. You could just type in my channel. Top 10 reasons CGC is a bad company. Top 5 reasons CGC is a bad company. You can look at all my CGC rant videos if you just want some backstories. If you're like, give me an example. I literally have top 5 videos of why they're a bad company. Go back. Watch them. You can see exact, like, examples of why they're bad. And this one is one of the worst. It's like you're handed a golden ticket. You actually, and to be honest with you, like, CGC, in my opinion now, did the right thing by authenticating this card and putting it in slab, and that might not sound like what a lot of people would think I would say after, like, that whole rant. But the problem is it's the right thing to put it in the slab, but it's also the right thing to give all the information out there to people. And then, in a way, let people make their own judgment. And going back to what I said earlier, it just should have been CGC saying, this is a real card. We did the XRF analysis on the pre-release stamp. Everything that we see lines up. But to, like, go above and beyond and do this whole lineage of this card and talk about how it was sourced from Wizard of the Coast and ignore all this stuff is very, very painful for somebody who does love this hobby, who does love the history of these cards, and to, like, in a way, like, hide that information. And to be honest with you, CGC could have reached out a little bit more and, like, found some more of the copies. I know people who potentially own that card. And if you want to know the name of that person, all you got to do is go back. Watch the name, or watch the interviews that I had with Joe Echo Base Collectibles. Go in. Joe mentions the actual name of the person that had those cards, how that person used to go around to some of the big, like, Pokemon League competitions. It was sitting in their binder. A lot of people that were, you know, in the actual competitive scene in 2002, 2001, they saw that card. And it was like one of the highlights of his binder. So we know there's more that exist out there. Now, the number 11 and stuff, like, again, this is Mike Boozer's, which goes strictly against, like, potentially that production manager and stuff like this. And now the problem is, too, is this going to be a thing where now CGC only ever authenticates these 2 cards? Well, what happens now? And this is an important what if. What happens now if you can reproduce that pre-release stamp? Because now there's a financial, like, incentive to recreate that pre-release stamp. Because I'm telling you, that card at auction is a 6-figure card easily at this point in this hobby. So if that card could be a 6-figure, you know, card, does it give people, like, a huge incentive to, in a way, recreate this pre-release stamp? And now, not only can they reproduce the pre-release stamp, unless CGC has withheld some information on the chemical composition of that card, if somebody really wants to go above and beyond, we got people going above and beyond, creating fake first edition cases, copying numbers, recreating barcodes. Just, they sadly reused a base set unlimited booster box barcode instead of the actual first edition box code, and maybe just had the wrong stop tape on there, could have went back and got the real stop tape. People will put in the effort to do this. People will go and reseal a base set, you know, pack with PSA 8 quality Chansey to make a couple $100. So when somebody opened that pack up and they it's a heavy pack. They sell it as a heavy. When they go through it and they get to that Chansey and it just has maybe not like maybe one print line, a couple beat up corners because somebody cracked it out of PSA slab, and then people will say, well, why would somebody resale a base set pack with a hollow? That doesn't make sense. Because it's plausible deniability. That's why. Because a fucking pre-release Chansey is like whatever, $100. A couple near mint commons, uncommons maybe set you back like another $30 because there's going to be like good condition raw cards. So you're all into a faked resale base set pack for $130, and you get to sell a heavy pack between $600 to $700, and then you have plausible deniability from now until forever because the people always say, well, why would somebody resale a pack with a heavy card with an actual hollow card? That doesn't make sense. Blah blah blah. Because people are dumb because they think, well, why would? Because people would just think like, oh, people are greedy. They want to just get all $700, so they're going to repack it with Sword and Shield commons and uncommons because they want to make $700 instead of spending $130. Instead of making $700, sure, they only make $570. Like, but they get to rinse and repeat that from now until forever because it's plausible deniability every sale. But now it goes back to the pre-release stamp. When you now have enough money in this card, what prevents somebody from just recreating this stamp? Those pre-release like letters are not some like WotC trademark pre-release stamping lettering. These pre-release stamps, like the lettering that was used was just common stuff. This is like the heat stamps is very much an aftermarket thing. So now the question is, well, what if somebody can create fake pre-release stamps? Because it's not during the printing process. It is something that is applied after the fact. The same way as everybody like talks about like the Dragon Majesty Charizards, the collector Charizard, shit like that. When people talk about the collector Charizard, that is an after the fact thing. Pre-release stamp is an after the fact thing. So now what happens if somebody can spend the time and create a good pre-release stamp that now cannot be told by like CGC? Now does CGC say, well, because now we can't prove where this card came from, we're not going to grade this card? And if that is the case, because now you have the potential of quote-unquote real fake stamp, so a real stamp somebody put on there but was not done at the Wizard of the Coast facility, maybe it is now done after the fact, and because they can't prove it comes from the Wizard of the Coast facility, they can't grade it, so be it. But now, what about the cards that were stamped, that were the actual official pre-release Raichus that were done at Wizard of the Coast? Are they also not going to grade those as well? And they're only ever going to like authenticate the 2 Dave Persons ones. Brings up a lot of what ifs. Namp90. Drew, I'm going to go back up to the top of the chat. Did my little rant enough. Drew said, hey, PK. Always good to see number 1 mod in the game. Peek to Pooh says CGC sucks. I agree with that statement. Again, everything I say about CGC is always my opinion. But my opinion is always stated. CGC's bad company. Potentially the worst that ever existed. Arguably in human history. One of the worst. Not the worst. One of the worst. Nam90 says, hey PK, I want to hear that Raichu is the best Pokemon at least 10 times in today's live. Oh yeah. It's the best Pokemon. Let's see. I want to scroll down. We got Pokey Snipes in the chat. It's funny. Today I messaged Pokey Snipes on Instagram. He gave me diaper. He was the one that gave me diapers when I was at Charlotte Collecticon for my son. And when he gave me the bag, it had a little rip, and I didn't think anything of it. I just thought it was a little wear and tear from him, like traveling through Collecticon with a pack of diapers. Didn't think anything of it. My newborn son has finally grown into the size diapers he bought me. My wife went, opened up the bag, and there it was the Team Up Raichu from Unified Minds. It was just sitting in there, like, perfect condition card, too, by the way. Pokesnipes, big shout out. And my wife's like, asked if my oldest son, like, did he get one of your cards and stick it in this pack of diapers? And I was like, no. And I was like, I don't even know where you would get that card from because I have one, but it's graded. It's not a raw one. I'm like, I don't even know where that came from. It took me a while to process in my mind. But yeah, Pokesnipes slid that Raichu in there with the diaper. So that was very cool, Pokesnipe. So I will grade that card, and that card will definitely go into my son's collection in the future. So I appreciate that, man. It was very thoughtful of you. And it was a cool thing that I didn't find for about a month later. Son of Mewtwo said, Drew, best mod in the game? Definitely, number 1. So Wu Ford said, in the Thrones of Sheet collecting, I found that all departments and company roles come with entirely different, like makeup, stories, motivations, access. Uh, yeah, so people are just saying, yeah, conflicting stories would never surprise me. And it's not about, we want conflicting stories, but I think it's just important to like present those stories too, you know? Uh, uh, let's see. Ross Smith said this shit isn't real, saying that the pre-release Raichu isn't real. Uh, let's see. Uh, Yeah, so Woolford said, yep, to suppress the contradictory info and not present like any other research thesis would be a historical L. And I think that's what it ended up being. It was a big historical L for CGC to not like put out all the information. And now the problem is in the future too, like, I mean, maybe we'll see CGC like, I don't know. CGC, they're kind of cowards for most of the stuff that they do wrong. Like, they very rarely ever backtrack. But, like, maybe it would be good if CGC can go out there and, like, walk us through more of their research process. Like, maybe they'll be like, we were aware of a production manager from Wizard of the Coast who did have contradictory information, and we did try to reach out to that production manager, but that production manager was unreachable or potentially passed away, or what, you know, maybe that's a more morbid thing to say, but even TCA Gaming said it himself, like, a lot could happen in 20 plus years, you know, like, but at least they could say, oh yeah, we were aware of this, we tried to like find this information out, but we weren't able to. But that's not a great answer either. It's like we were aware of this information, but because we couldn't get an answer of it, we just ignored it. Like, that's also not a perfect answer too, you know? Uh, let's see. Yeah. People are saying providence in other markets calls upon transparency. I think transparency is just, it's transparent. And like, yeah. Is it bad to just say we want more transparency, especially on a card like this? Because this is not just some random, you know, psychic energy that somebody graded. Like, it's not. We're talking about literally the pre-release Raichu I talked about as being potentially one of the most famous cards in this hobby. And it definitely one of the most legendary cards in this hobby, and definitely a card that has arguably some of the most mystique around that card, and card that people have been talking about forever. Like, this is not a new conversation. CGC talks about it in their article that the earliest known information they could find from that card was from 2002. Like, that is more or less the entire history of this hobby. People have been speculating on that card. You know, for English release of that card, we're only talking 99. So the fact that they're able to find information on that card being talked about in 2002 is pretty much like the entire history of this hobby. That card was being discussed by people. And then the debate has always been there. And, but like, that's the thing. Like, debates have two sides to a debate. And the answer usually probably falls somewhere in between, somewhere in the middle. But when you're having a debate, you don't just ignore one side of that debate in order to just like justify yourself. Because if that's the case, then you're going to always win 100% of the time. Oh, I had to sneeze. Shout out to Professor Oak. Let's see. Let's see. Oh. Brokemon Card says PK is going off on a company that isn't here, nor do they care to defend themselves. Listen, I've made enough videos about CGC. They could feel free to like defend themselves at any point they want. CGC does not want to defend themselves, especially when a lot of the information is true. Like, do we want to do this? I mean, Brokemon Cards, do we want to do it? Like, CGC could defend themselves for this stuff. Their highest, when they first started as a company, their highest grade, which was the perfect 10, was behind a paywall. Yeah, pretty shitty. CGC, when they first became a company, were afraid to give out 10s. The Pop Report proved that. CGC, when they first were a company, they clearly were giving better grades to cards that didn't have subgrades, and they were grading cards harsher that did have subgrades. Like, all the proof is out there. You don't have to go too far. You can look at the original snippets of the pop report. You can look at cards like the non-hollow Vivid Voltage Charizard, which came in the theme decks, was also available in packs at the time when the pop report was released. Had over 2,000 of those cards graded, and it had a total PSA 10 population of a whopping fucking 0. That is a non-hollow card from Vivid Voltage, a relatively okay print quality set, and had a total population of 0 in a PSA 10. They graded those cards much harsher. You look at populations today, those populations in PSA 10 are crazy numbers. So those are all true things. In 2021, first, in early 2021, PSA said that we are no longer charging people for their submissions up front. They will only be charging their credit card when their submission is done and ready to be shipped. Come the end of 2021, the fiscal year, they hit everybody with grading fees in December 2021. And when you called up their accountant department, even though it happened to everybody, their accountant department said, "Oh, this is the first time I've heard of that mistake happen." They just lied to everybody on the phone. This is all documented stuff. This is all stuff. CGC is welcome to come out and say how any of that stuff is false. How at the end of 2021, a bunch of people weren't charged for their submissions after they had already made a press release telling people they won it, and then not shipping those cards out for months after the fact. CGC is welcome to talk about their advertised turnaround times in November and December of 2020. Advertised turnaround times of 30 business days, and those turnaround times ended up being 180. They're welcome to talk about any of this stuff. Like, sure, go off on a company that doesn't... It's not that they're not here to defend themselves. They just don't care to defend themselves. Yeah. Let's see. And I think I might have misread your comment. I don't think you were disagreeing with me now that I reread your comment. But I don't like CGC. They're just such a bad company. And the fact that they graded... the fact that they graded pre-release cards, stolen cards, that's a better way to put it. Cards that, like Shining Fates Charizard, when they didn't know the set name, they just put it as early release. And they didn't know the set name. They couldn't even say it was a Shining Fates Charizard. They just labeled it as an early release Charizard. Graded it, and let that card have a premium onto the market. Like, whatever. Let's see. Yeah. So, Good Shad says, it's easy marketing for CGC. Look at all these YouTubers just pumping their brand. Easy marketing. I don't think I pump CGC's brand. But then again, I'm also told that CGC is the Cabal grading company. And I'm also told that I am a member of the Cabal, but I don't know. I guess I like CGC if I'm a member of the Cabal. So that all the rants I've done about CGC, take that with a grain of salt. That I actually secretly love CGC. Anyways, yeah. So, ComDrive said PSA opened up in Japan, CGC opening up in China. Yeah. All right, this was enough of a rant. I wanted to put this video out there. I thought this was going to be a short video. I was like, just talk about the pre-release Raichu. I don't think I'm going to have much to talk about, 20 minutes, but I forgot CGC is involved, so always got something to talk about. But, as always, guys, listen, appreciate every single one of you. I might not do a live tomorrow night. Maybe, maybe not. I know Rattle's going to be doing a Paradox Rift opening, so I recommend you guys all tuning into that. And then Saturday, it will be a later live. It will be around 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to have Peek That Chew on. We're going to be talking more in depth on that pre-release Raichu. Again, he is friends with Dave Persons. I do want to know if Peek That Chew actually knew that Dave owned 2 of those pre-release Raichus this whole time. And we're going to get a real in-depth dive a little bit into World's promos, recent auction prices, stuff like that. So, guys, appreciate every single one of you. And as always, catch you on the next video.